Okay, just wanted to let people know before I hit recording. Thank you everyone for coming. This is the second lecture in a rule of law lecture series. As you know, Afghanistan is undergoing serious changes, and one of the early casualty of those changes was the change in the fundamentals of the legal system in the country. Um, those changes have raised serious questions about the state of rule of law in the country, whether laws matter, whether people's rights, most of which are no longer protected by former rules, are still there. Is there any meaningful way to talk about rights in the Afghan context, since the current regime doesn't seem to care about international law and the domestic laws of the country that protected those rights are also mostly abrogated? We wanted to start conversations about those topics. The first lecture was delivered by Professor Jensen, who examined those as assertions and provided his insight as to why not all those assertions may be accurate, why there are going to be continuities because laws are instrumental in functioning of any society. So he was trying to question some of those as assertions. Today we're going to look at the issues of rights and whether there is a meaningful way to talk about rights in the Afghan context with Taliban in power. And we are incredibly honored to have Professor Goldfarb with us on this topic. And many of you have taken classes with Professor Goldfarb, so you are very much familiar with him. But for those who are not, Professor Goldfarb is a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the New School for Social Research. He's also a Senior Fellow at Regional Center for Democratic Studies. He's a co-executive editor of Public Seminar and a special advisor to the provost of the New School Publishing Initiative. His work is primarily focused on issues of culture, sociology, politics, and rights. He's authored many books, but I think the most famous book is The Politics of a Small Thing, which actually touches on the theme we are talking about today as well. We were lucky that Professor Goldfarb agreed to be a university professor at the AUAF starting a couple of semesters ago. I've had the privilege of talking to him multiple times, and I've learned a great deal from him. I'm sure you will find this lecture also equally illuminating and informative. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Goldfarb. There is going to be a brief lecture / presentation, and afterwards, I will try to ask some questions, and then we'll open up to the floor, and we'll take questions from you and other colleagues that are here. You can type in your questions in the meantime if you wish, or you can just note them for yourself and ask them with audio later on. Professor Goldfarb, please.
Well, thank you very much, Haroon. It's really an honor to be here. I have met colleagues at the American University a few years ago, just before and after the Taliban victory, and have admired the university's work. It is committed to ideals that are very, very dear to me, and the institution reminds me of the place where I studied and the place where I worked, the University of Chicago and the New School for Social Research. It's the commitments to academic freedom, critical inquiry, and crucially, the ideals of the liberal arts are very, very familiar to me. And I have a great deal of respect for all of you for pursuing these ideals under very, very difficult circumstances. So I come here as your colleague and your teacher, and I'm honored to have both of those positions, to have those relationships with you. I also have to say that I'm a little bit surprised and challenged by giving a lecture in this series. I know the rule of law. I've had the great good fortune to live in a country that has something like aspires to the rule of law. There are institutional laws that actually do have regulative and normative impact on our lives. There are formal freedoms in my country. So I benefit from it. And also, I know I have many friends and colleagues and even relatives from around the world who have lived in societies where there essentially is no rule of law, no functioning rule of law. I myself have spent time living in communist Europe and have experiences there about what it means to live in a society where the rule of law is really not operating. And it's even the case that my son's wife comes from China, another country where there effectively is no rule of law. Though I must say that Professor Jensen makes a very, very important point that on the one hand, one could make a global or a macro observation that the rule of law is not operating. But in fact, that's never completely the case because societies need and polities need laws. And even in societies where apparently there is the rule of law is not, doesn't seem to be decisive, there are many laws and rules that are operating in order for the society, for people to get on with their lives, all different aspects of their lives. So that said, I know what it means to live in a society that benefits, has the gift of the rule of law in the full sense of the term, though it's never perfect. And I know what it means to live in a society where the rule of law is challenged. I appreciate the rule of law, but I'm not an expert on law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal scholar. So when Haroon asked me to give a talk in this series, I immediately asked him. I said yes, I'd like to. But I also said, but let's talk. I want to have a conversation with you so I can figure out what I could say, what I would have to say. And in fact, in conversation with Haroon, I discovered a topic that I thought I might explore with you. And in some ways, I think that this presentation I think of this presentation as a continuation of the conversation Haroon and I had, and I'm hoping that I'll speak relatively briefly, and that Haroon and I, and then all of you will join in this conversation, which I think is important. So I've written a formal paper upon which this presentation is based. Maybe if we were in the same physical space, I would enjoy reading from the paper in a kind of impassioned way, and you would understand what I have to say. But I know from experience that reading papers on Zoom meetings is deadly. So what I'm going to do is talk about my paper and not deliver it, and inevitably that will increase the dramaturgic value of my presentation, but I may miss things. So if I don't explore things sufficiently, or if you're puzzled about what I'm asserting, I really welcome questions that kind of seek clarification, especially clarification on four more main points that I want to make. So I want to, four main propositions. So the first is a proposition that comes out of the experience of the democratic opposition in East Central Europe, in the clandestine society during communist times. And this is what Haroon and I, in our conversations, I said, we could apply this. And the proposition is this: when people act as if they are free, even in the most repressive of circumstances, they are consequentially free as long as they can sustain their actions. So we should think about that. Think about it as a general proposition in any type of society, and think about it as it applies to the present circumstance in Afghanistan. That proposition, as a sociologist, I know, is a specific application of a broader sociological theorem, sometimes called the Thomas theorem. And it says, W.I. Thomas wrote, is credited with having written, if men define situation as real, they are real in their consequences. Okay. Those are the two simple propositions that, and then I want to apply them as far to the situation of human rights, the rule of law and the human rights. I will attempt to provide a supplement, if not an alternative, to, on the one hand, idealistic, philosophical, and theological groundings of the University of Rights, of Human Rights. And I will attempt to show the limitations of overly realistic, skeptical critiques of the universality based on the proposition that only states can guarantee rights. So I'll explain more as I proceed. My goal then, this is the fourth point, my goal then is to demonstrate that rights are socially constituted apart from the power of the state, and that this has relevance for the American University of Afghanistan community, for the people of Afghanistan, in country and in the diaspora, and far beyond, for people in many other places. So this comes out of the discussion with Haroon, and the center is acting as if one lives in a free society. And the general principle is the application of the W.I. Thomas's definition, notion of the definition of the situation. I can explain what I mean, the meaning of Thomas's proposition of the definition of the situation. If men define a situation as real, it's real in its consequences, by observing some problems with the proposition. First of all, it uses the word man. And it doesn't say men and women, it doesn't say people, it says man. Now, when I was growing up, I was taught that when it says man, it doesn't only mean men, it also means men and women. But there's a funny thing happened on the way for this proposition to become popular or significant in the sociological literature. For those of you who are have taken or are taking courses with me, Irving Goffman's whole sociology is really based on this proposition. So, well, the funny thing that happened is that W.I. Thomas was credited with the proposition, but the sentence first appeared in writing in a book not just written by W.I. Thomas, but also his wife, Dorothy Swain Thomas. So W.I. and D.S. Thomas made this proposition, but in the kind of memory of sociology, Dorothy has been dropped out. Now, that's interesting because it turns out that the currency of the idea comes from, credited to W.I. Thomas, suggests first of all, is the problem that's man and not people. That people, that, has been addressed over the years. But people have mostly forgotten about Dorothy Swain Thomas. And that they forgot about Dorothy Swain Thomas suggests that social scientific inquiry is a male domain. And the Chicago School includes W.I. Thomas, but not Dorothy Swain Thomas, and also not Jane Addams, who was actually a very important, is known as being a very important kind of social welfare activist. But she was in Chicago and she did really important work, and people have fundamentally, for a long period of time, kind of saw her as being involved in applied sociology, not being really very serious when in fact she was. Another example of this, when I studied sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, the very, very famous Black activist, theorist, but trained sociologist with the first PhD by a Black man from Harvard University. I didn't read him either. So the sociology that I read when I was a student was also overwhelmingly white, even though from its very beginnings, there was an key African American thinker. Okay, so I think you get the proposition about the definition of the situation. If we define this situation that we're in right now as a situation where we're learning together, where I'm giving a lecture, part of the work we have to actually do the expressive and verbal and nonverbal work to actually make it a university lecture. Okay, so that then was applied. Wasn't applied. The activists in East Central Europe in the 1970s and 1980s started working according to the second proposition I presented to you, and which is more central to our inquiry today. That is that if we act as free and we're not stopped from engaging in our actions, we essentially are creating a free society. So a first instance of that in Poland was there was a workers' strike in 1975. It was the third workers' strike in communist Poland. I'm not going to tell you the whole history, but in 1975, the workers were repressed, jailed, and silenced. And a group of intellectuals, mostly in another city, developed a campaign which was called the Committee to Defend Workers. And they, intellectuals and workers were relatively apart in Poland, so this was a key moment in Polish history. And then they started publishing outside of official censorship. Alternative publishing didn't exist at all in Poland. Everything that was put into print that occurred on the streets. I was once arrested for taking part in an illegal theater production on the streets. Anything that was not approved by the Communist Party, nothing that wasn't approved by the Communist Party appeared on the streets or appeared in print. Well, someone started a publication called the Bulletin of Information. And a group of people, and they didn't only publish this Bulletin of Information, but they put their names and addresses on the publication. So they were daring the authorities to repress them. And essentially, the readership was relatively small, but it started growing. And one thing led to another, and not only a bulletin of information, but then alternative political journals, alternative literary journals started being published following the same format. When I look at that bulletin of information, and I look at my email, my American University of Afghanistan email, I see a remarkable similarity between the Bulletin of Information and Assad Chakari's ground reports that come out of Afghanistan. So the point is that apart from the regime in Eastern Europe, they started engaging in public action that was not approved by the party, but that in the end the party couldn't or wouldn't repress. And what happened, from this simple journal of newsletter that reported on the arrests and the fates of various people, the needs of the strikers, families for assistance, all the kind of not only an alternative publishing network, but an alternative network of social welfare was put into place. And one thing led to another. As I said, there were many, many journals. Eventually, this started in 1976. Eventually, by the early 1980s, the alternative publishing published books, journals, poetry, literary kind of nights in private apartments existed. An independent flying university was established. It was called the Flying University, named after a similar development in Poland in the late 19th century. So essentially, and the scale was striking. So by the early mid 1980s, the people who wrote novels or wrote essays or poetry really had a choice to publish officially or unofficially. And it was not at all clear that the official publications would reach a larger audience. And it was pretty clear that it wouldn't reach if one were critical, it wouldn't reach the most desirable audience. So it wasn't a clandestine or an underground public sphere. It became actually a competing public sphere. And this simple proposition that I presented as the first one that we wanted to examine, the idea of acting as if you lived in a free society, actually turned in a significant way Poland into a free society, or at least a segment of Poland into a free society. Now, the success in Poland, and to a lesser extent among its neighbors in engaging in these activities, was not guaranteed. And in different countries, this type of activity had different degrees of success. And then if you analyze these societies and trying to understand their public life, understand the political situation, you'd have to, a key issue was the strength of the alternative public sphere and the capacity of the authorities to repress them. So in 1981, martial law was declared in Poland. All the people who were visibly engaged in these activities were on lists to be arrested. Some of them managed to avoid arrest. Most of them actually were arrested. And practically the day after the martial law was declared and these people were all interned, new publications started appearing. So what developed was not just a resistance force or an alternative politics, but a whole alternative society was developing. Now, I want to remind you that in my classes, I've been assigning two key figures who are authors of this, and in some ways inspired this activity, Adam Michnik and Václav Havel. So Adam Michnik's New Evolutionism. He's usually credited with the proposition that I read, and Václav Havel, who later became president of the country. Now, but it's not just Havel and Michnik. For every person like Havel and Michnik who wrote something that was then published, there were dozens of people who had to actually publish the work, distribute the work. So a complex social fabric of alternative free space was actually created in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland at this time. Now, how am I doing for time?
We have 10, 15 minutes if you want to keep to the 30-minute lecture time. But if you
okay,
want
so I may go a few minutes over 30, but we'll shoot for it. So I think it's the proposition I'm going to make in the conclusion, as it has to do with the rule of law, is that the rule of law, for it to be vibrant and critical, and to include some application of the universality of human rights, needs this kind of public space, requires this kind of public space. It's not only states, I want to argue, that are necessary to achieve human rights. It's a society, a social fabric that has to actually be a support for this. The comparison to today is kind of really interesting. It's really easier now to create alternative publications, to mobilize oppositional demonstrations, even in very repressive societies. Thinking of your neighbor in Iran, the way the movement developing now in Iran with its ups and downs, people could get involved and coordinate with each other much more rapidly than in the pre-internet age, in the pre-social media age. With social media, our capacity to mobilize, to meet each other, to speak to each other in some way is remarkably greater now. It seems that things are much better now, but there are problems now. I think we should think about two types of problems for developing such alternative public space, such alternative free space, such alternative space that recognizes human rights. One, on the one hand, it can rapidly form, but also rapidly declines. So the endurance I'm forgetting a word that the persistence of the activity is hard to, its sustainability is hard to maintain. Now, the very difficulty of mobilizing in the past actually created social networks which were not easily destroyed. The ease of mobilizing now makes it so just turn off the internet, kind of attack visible leaders. The web also provides remarkable capacity for surveillance. Remember, I said it's a struggle between the capacity of a repressive state and the capacity of a free public to mobilize. So the balance is to initiate something is to initiate a free space is easier. To sustain a free space is perhaps harder, given the media that we depend on. And then also think about the quality of the discussion. Now, the publications of the alternative space that I spoke about in East Central Europe included Michnik's article on the new evolutionism and Václav Havel's article, The Power of the Powerless, the two assigned works in my class. And as a matter of fact, The Power of the Powerless first appeared. The idea of the article was Adam Michnik's. This is Havel's. Havel and Michnik were talking, let's say like Haroon and I were talking, and Michnik challenged Havel to write up what he was talking about. They met clandestinely on the border in the mountain region on the border between Czechoslovakia and Poland. And then Havel wrote the piece, and it wasn't published. It couldn't be published in Czechoslovakia because their capacity to publish, the state was much more repressive in Czechoslovakia. So it was actually published in Poland. But the quality it was often quite remarkable. And compare that to the kinds of exchanges the diaspora and people inside Afghanistan have on social media today. The social media seems to lead us to shout at each other, to say, I have honor, you don't. I suspect you. You assert this, and I know that what interests are behind you. We mark and this is not just an Afghan problem by any means. American public life, public discourse has taken an absolute nosedive, and the nosedive really frames gives the quality of our social media interactions is articulated in our general political life. And that's true for, maybe for Afghanistan, you tell me about that. It's true for the United States. It's certainly true in Russia. It's certainly true in Hungary. It's certainly true in Brazil and in Turkey. All these countries where there's an ascendance of authoritarianism, an important social support for it is the quality of public life, the quality of public discourse. So my general proposition, and I want to say just a couple of more things before. I suppose it's around time now, right? Yeah. So talking about zeroing in on the issue of human rights and the relationship between human rights and this argument I'm making about the quality of a society to create alternative publics. Back then, one of the kind of external factors that precipitated this development was the signing of the Helsinki Accords. Now, the Helsinki Accords in 1975, the Helsinki Accords essentially stabilized the post-war status quo, the post-war geopolitical status quo in Europe. The Accords recognized the legitimacy of all the existing states. It recognized the borders of all the existing states, and it recognized the territorial integrity and the internal sovereignty of all the states. So, from that point of view, it was probably helped sustain the post-war peace, which now in Europe has been breached, but it also was a tremendous victory for the communist authorities because it legitimated their sovereignty over their country. It recognized their control over the internal affairs of their country. But there was an added agreement, and the added agreement had to do with the respect for civil rights. And it looked like just a fig leaf, but the oppositions in Eastern Europe and international oppositions to various types of tyranny used the Helsinki Accords to create first Helsinki Watch and then Human Rights Watch, which no doubt is Human Rights Watch is not right today examining what's going on in Afghanistan. And so this type of international, informal interaction among people, sustaining human rights, had supported what was going on in the opposition in Eastern Europe, but also very importantly, Human Rights Watch could work exactly because these alternative publics in East Central Europe existed. There's a way in which my friends, Adam Michnik and Václav Havel, could look and be inspired by this provision, international provision, and motivated to act. But then what looked like just a fig leaf became a reality because people started acting as if they are free. And it made the ideal of human rights not just one that is philosophically or religiously kind of asserted or supported. And I want to be very clear, I'm not arguing against philosophical and religious justifications for human rights. What's important is that these ideas are put into practice. And they're put into practice not only by heroes, but by ordinary people. And so human rights only have a chance to be universal if people act as if they live in a free society. And if they define their societies, and that means societies, sometimes people use the term to describe nation state. But societies are networks of individuals and groups interacting with each other. So if it doesn't mean that if we act according to the principles of human rights and we fight for them, then they exist. If we're repressed, then we're repressed. But they exist only if we fight for them. And now I'll kind of shift to the lucky countries. So in the fortunate countries, my good fortune of living, that my grandparents came to the United States from Russia, and therefore I live in a society where there is a rule of law. The rule of law is sustained and meaningful only if, even in formerly free societies, people act as if they're free. And if they don't act as if they're free, even if there are written to the formal law statutes that give people human rights, if people don't act as if they're free, if they are just subservient, if they accept sexism, racism, ethnic domination, nationalism, then the societies aren't free. So in a country as fortunate as mine, there was this very, very great jurist, Thurgood Marshall. For most of his life, Thurgood Marshall was the leading civil rights attorney fighting for the rights of African Americans. In the last part of his career, he became a Supreme Court justice. Both as a Supreme Court justice and as a civil rights lawyer, he was actually making it so that the stated ideal of human rights in the United States was a reality, and he knew all along that it wasn't a complete reality. So in sum, what I'm arguing for is the very importance of our acting, the necessity of action, the necessity of the American university acting as if it lived in a free society and as if the ideals, liberal arts ideals, are real. And just, I don't want you to think that I'm a dreamy person and that this is, I'm this optimistic. I'm not optimistic, but I'm just this idealist. This has very practical applications. So I'm new to observing Afghanistan and its history. And one thing that I note is that there's this kind of the history of the last century, last 150 years is a history of aspiration for greater autonomy, greater freedom, decency, let's say, having to do with the rights of women, which is absolutely central now in your country, and kind of radical reversals. And so the only way the radical reversals don't happen, the only way why one tyranny is not replaced by another tyranny is if people live as if they're free and constitute the human rights in their social interactions, so that it makes for an immediate change, but it also makes it more likely that when the next major social transformation, political transformation happens in the society, that what follows won't be a mirror image of what you are now experiencing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldfarb. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I know we discussed many of these themes before, but I always learn something new when I listen to you. I appreciate you taking the time for the lecture. I would like to remind everyone that they can raise their hand or type in their questions. I will start with a question of my own. Listening to you, it seems like the fundamental kind of proposition is that in countries like Afghanistan, or maybe historically communist Europe, when there is an official kind of public space and a regulated, monitored public space where the ruling authority is trying to enact a form of reality, their ideology.
Right.
The key is to create alternative, subversive public space where people can interact, actually talk about the truths of what is their lives, and also come up with alternative visions of what they want for society, even if it's in a very small scale. I mean, I know your book talks about just with your friends, if you are just discussing the issues of the day, but you're discussing it from a critical point of view, not accepting the formal kind of position or the regime. That creates cracks in the formal regime ideology or their formal narrative, and eventually it could lead to breakthroughs and creation of a free society. But you're also, I think, by talking about kind of social media, are saying not all form of interactions, not all forms of give and take will lead to those kind of outcomes. Actually, hyper form of interactions we have in social media today can actually be counterproductive. I mean, we also saw that in the developed world, in like free societies, social media actually created opportunities for populism and kind of threatened the free society. A lot of fringe movements are becoming mainstream by the fact that they can reach larger publics, and there is no formal control. I mean, there is the idea of free speech defeating itself, or liberalism defeating itself, that is being popularly discussed. Afghanistan obviously it's not about a deconstructing a liberal society that may happen on social media or the way we are interacting. But it seems like it is preventing people from actually forming those kind of alternative public spaces you are thinking about. Because Afghans are very active on social media, at least the youth are. I mean, they are there. There's a lot of material that being consumed. There's a lot of information that being exchanged. But it doesn't seem to be those kind of considered, thoughtful, action-driven interactions that you're describing in the context of at least Poland.
Yeah.
What do you think is like missing, or what would make a difference in the way we actually interact? Because a lot of us have a choice in terms of what we do. I tweet, and I think other people write and think and say things. how can we say things or act in a way that is more conducive to the former rather than the Poland version, not the kind of destructive version that we sometimes
Right.
observe in Afghanistan.
I mean, you know, we, I mean, there's a media challenge. You know, about 10, 15 years ago, it's probably more like 15 years ago, I had this intuition. Maybe it's even 20 years ago. I had this, you know, when I wrote The Politics of Small Things, there's a chapter entitled The Internet plus the Politics of Small Things equals alternatives. And it was before social media, but and I had this kind of I thought I saw something, which I think I wasn't completely right. That in some ways the early iterations of blogging and were more deliberative, more thoughtful, and interactive in comparison to talk radio. And I sort of had, you know, this idea: right-wing talk radio, progressive social, you know, blogging, and the form does, especially the media form, especially as it's presented to us, does present opportunities and limitations. So the internet plus the algorithm equals no alternatives, or thin discussion, or something like that, maybe we could say. But I then decided, after writing that book, I had one more book in me, but I realized that intellectual life, political culture itself, was migrating from the printed word to the screen. So I was early in observing that. Some of my colleagues thought I was an idiot, not an idiot, but foolish. How can you talk about these email exchanges as being equivalent to your kitchen table in cafes? But in fact, now we all know that, and we're troubled by the limitations. So I saw the general tendency, and I actually created a blog entitled Deliberately Considered. And I attempted to create a media form. It wasn't going to affect the whole society, but in my social circles, where the new media would be used to sustain more deliberate, more with greater quality, political and cultural observation and discussion. I think that we have to work with the tools that we have, that the media, there's no kind of formula that we can follow and suddenly we'll all be smart again, or engage in smart conversation. I don't want to make it sound like everything that was published in the Polish alternative public sphere was of very, very, you know, excellent quality. I picked two of the greatest essays that came out of it. So, you know, be wary of political nostalgia. But I do think that we have to figure out ways that we can talk to each other, or you have to figure out ways, but I'm involved now too, that can sustain a public life that has higher quality. I think we have to be inventive. I mean, I you know, one interesting development in post-war Poland, starting in the 1940s, is a group of not crazy anti-communists, not fascists or ideologues, and not nationalists, created a literary political journal that they published in Paris called Kultura, and it was called, in Polish, it was Kultura Paryskie, because there was a Polish cult. There was a a magazine coming out of Paris named Culture, and there was a magazine in Warsaw named Culture, with the name of Culture, and it played a remarkable role in kind of developing kind of high quality discussion reports about what was going on in Poland. And I think when we were talking the first time, I said, maybe we need to think about creating some high quality journal, some high quality magazine. Maybe the American University of Afghanistan should have a project to create such a space where people across ethnicities with different ideas of how to respond to the Taliban discuss current events and future prospects. Maybe something like that exists, in which that would be great, and then we should support it. But if it doesn't exist, maybe some people should create that, and it would be easier to do than it was in the 1940s in Paris, or in the 1970s and 80s in Warsaw, because our capacity it's pretty easy to create an online platform. And in that online platform, I'm imagining now, so you get the idea. I don't have to go into all the details. So the answer is that is again in our action. So the politics of small things. The argument is that embedded in our everyday interactions is the possibility of alternatives. Also embedded in our everyday interactions are repression. It's popular in the United States, this idea of microaggressions, and certainly they do exist. So there's micro-liberations and microaggressions, and we have to kind of work on the micro-liberations. But then we can build beyond just respecting each other in face-to-face interaction, or even through Zoom, and start speaking to our neighbors, think about alternative ways of publishing. Okay, I answered your question. I hope to your satisfaction.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And obviously I can talk to you for hours, but I will move on to others. I think one of our students, Dusti, has asked a similar question that I did. What makes this moment different than the kind of events that took place in the period of time you studied, which I think you touched on. The forum seems to be different, at least if we focus on the way we can create public spaces. So I'm not going to repeat that. I think Khabir had his hand raised before others posted their questions. So Khabir, you can ask your question and then I'll move on to others.
Sure. Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Professor Goldfarb, for the in-depth lecture. I'll be quite brief. If we look throughout our history in Afghanistan, we hugely failed to promote and we somehow struggled to promote and advocate the human rights in Afghanistan, because the way our people perceived human rights left a negative footprint in Afghanistan. We can see the examples in the current regime, because at that time in the public regime we centralized our focus very much on how we impress the international community when it comes to practicing human rights. And as an Afghan myself, I can see, of course, I'm a law graduate from AUF as well. I could see how our people struggled to understand the definition of human rights, how it should be practiced, because as I said, we always felt that it's important for us that if we have to inject the mindset of having human rights in Afghanistan, we have to impress the international community. And then, of course, we set a negative footprint on that. And especially, ignoring our culture, our tradition, our religion, and of course, the public opinion. We of course, Raimi Saib knows as well as a legal scholar that, we struggle to, promote human rights in majority part of Afghanistan. most of our people, you know, you have this misperception of human rights being a westernized, practiced human rights in Afghanistan. What do you think, considering the current regime? Because as we all can see, the international community is, you know, struggling. They are frustrated of how they can convince this regime that, you know, human rights, of course, obviously the women rights, that it's the spotlight. How we can convince the current regime that, of course, you know, what you are understanding for human rights is not what you are, you know, are
Yeah.
seeing the examples that was from the Republic regime.
Thank
So
you very much.
and for the future, Professor Goldfarb, what kind of, you know, points we should consider to have a very negative or a very positive outcome of practicing human rights, and convince the current regime that, you know, rights, these basic rights for, especially for women, is very important and is very crucial for the
Thank you.
future of
Right,
Afghanistan.
right.
And this connects, before you answer, it connects to what Nahid is asking in the chat as well. I think she's basically asking, where do they come from, these human rights, and why should we
Right.
care? As a matter of discourse, even. I'm sure substantively people agree that humans have dignity and such, but human right as a discourse, as you know, comes with a lot of institutions, with
Right.
a lot of terminology
Right.
and such.
Right.
And some people are sensitive to those. And I think Khabir is asking the same thing of, is it useful to use this whole discourse of human rights in the Afghan context?
I'm agnostic about that, to tell you the truth. Terms like, I'm deeply committed to democracy. I'm deeply committed to human rights. I'm a feminist. You know, liberal ideals are important to me. Socialist ideals are important to me. But each of these words, I know we have to handle with care, because people use them as part of a package and it's pre-packaged for people, especially with little power in the geopolitical world, such as Afghanistan. So you know, the human rights are, to the degree to which they exist, I don't think come from God. I don't think that we can they're not ultimately based on a view of God, a view of reason, philosophy, or necessarily from the state, or, you know, I should, you know, to answer the question, the international community. You know, the thrust of my argument and my conviction is that all of these ideals are real. Back to the Thomases are real if we define them as being real, and we have to define them as being real in interaction with each other, and in our discrete interactions, not just an interaction with a monitoring agency from someplace else, or a foundation that will give support for your activity. You have to deal with those things. You have to you know, I'm practical. You have to negotiate with limiting states, limiting foundations, limiting international communities. But ultimately, these things have a meaning. Human rights have meaning only if the community, in interaction, the people in the community. So I want to be careful. It's not just individuals, and it's not a culture, big thing culture, a big thing community. It's the community and a culture as human individuals are interacting with each other, as they're enacting these principles. So when it comes to the issue of the rights of women in Afghanistan, Afghan people have to interact with each other and decide for themselves. And especially people who are aspiring for equal rights of women, women have to assert the rights that they believe they have. And they have to do it with each other. They have to do it in women's groups. They have to do it in interaction with men, in interaction with the authorities of the American University of Afghanistan. It will exist if they act, and exactly what exists depends on what they believe and how they act. That's what makes it real. It's not, and if an outside force tells you it should be X, Y, and Z, and it doesn't seem to apply to you, then you have to say yes, but, or work on it. This doesn't yield any preconceived conclusion, though I have my commitments, as I imagine each one of you does as well. And the struggle is to actually act according to the commitments that you have so that they become real.
Thank you so much for a great answer. Rashida, you had your hand raised. I don't know if you changed your mind or not. If you would like to, please go ahead. You can speak. Otherwise, we move to Beriole. Okay, Rashida it might have been a mistake or something. Beriole, please go ahead.
Hey, Professor. Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Rahimi, Professor Goldfarb. My question is actually that in developing societies like Afghanistan and other societies, religion speaks first, and also every society has its own beliefs, values. So having a collection of articles by the name of international human rights will not serve, as actually it has been proven in every society. For example, if it has been made by the West, it will not serve or be applicable in the East. And if it has been made in the East, it will not be applicable in the West. So society has their own differences and beliefs. My question is actually, is there any mechanism in order to make this human rights accordingly? For example, in the Constitution of Afghanistan, we say that no treaties, no laws could be against the religion, which of course Islam. So if we make these human rights and international human rights accordingly and based on the society, don't you think it will be more fit and more applicable, and we will not the government or the applicable authority will not have problem applying that on the society? Thank you.
So that's a very interesting and challenging question, and I think I have to go answer it by kind of expressing a concern about what we mean by a society and the West having this view, the East having that view. I'm an American, and I'm an honorary Pole, and I know that there's no American position on any of this. There are American positions with an S in the plural. And the same is true of Poland. And Poland has some analogies to Afghanistan in this regard, because at least some political currents, cultural currents in Poland identify Poland as being essentially Catholic. So Pole Catholic one is a slogan. And but there are Poles who are not Catholics. There are Poles who have other religions. There are Poles who have no religion. There are Poles who are Catholic but don't think of their identity as being Polish, is essentially their Catholicism. And though clearly in Afghanistan, Islam is central to a vast majority of the population's identity, there is Islam and there is Islam. There are different readings of Islam. There's different readings of what of the applications of Islamic law. I think I understand Haroon's intellectual project as being centered on this. So there really is. My first answer is that beware of statements that say the West thinks this, the East thinks that. This happens in the developing world. The whole world is developing. There's no place that's fully developed. We're all developing. There used to be analysis of what was happening in the former Soviet bloc as saying these are societies in transition. And I would, and there was even like almost a school of thought of inquiry, transitionology, but all societies are in transition. As every individual is in transition, socially, psychologically, and alas, biologically as well. And so we should be very, very careful about that. And then, how human rights are conceived in Afghanistan and its relationship to Islam depends upon Afghans and the authority and what this authority, the present regime or an early regime asserted is something to be dealt with, to be accepted, rejected, modified, qualified. And then there's also the case, it's not only that these ideas exist in their multiplicity or in all their complexity, it's also that society, various cultural projects that tend towards totalitarianism, imagine uniformity in a population. And I think that it's pretty clear that crucial to the human condition, all human beings, in all circumstances, is that we're diverse. Even in the most simple societies, there are differences among people. And the issue of, I think that, maybe a starting point in addressing the problems of human rights is how do people deal with their differences? I think that, that maybe that, I don't know, but as I'm answering your question, I'm thinking that maybe that's the first principle that starts this discussion. And maybe there's a literature on this. I don't know it.
No, I'm in my own thinking, and I do sympathize with what was said because I believe incentives do matter, and those who control resources and patronage can incentivize people to think one way versus another, and people can, as you know, rationalize their self-interest as a position that is adopted based on principle or belief. So I think there are ways to incentivize changes along those lines by those in power, and I think it has been done. So I accept that criticism that maybe the set of incentives that existed did not incentivize people to engage with the local population and try to reach a local understanding of it. But I agree with you. I mean, the fundamental thing for me is the idea of persuasion. People feeling the need to talk to others, understand them, and then actually persuade them rather than shout at them, alienate them, or use force to silence them. There's this idea that some people believe, even in the US, that the best way to solve US problem is to eliminate a portion of the population, like fundamentally, just not from the conversation, but physically eliminate them. That was obviously not fascism, Nazis' idea that if we just engineer the population, we'll achieve some sort of ideal society. I think the premise should be that no, even those who you consider to be their views consider to be appalling, you have to engage with them, understand, and persuade them. And that changes them and you, obviously, it's interactive.
I want to actually concede this critical thrust, though, or highlight this critical point, which I didn't emphasize. Indeed, it's not all non-distorted communication. It's not all pure discussion. There are incentives. You know, the incentives of the state, the incentives of the international community, the demands of your local community, leads. You know, we kind of seek a world where persuasion matters, but the way we act is a combination of the way we're constrained to act and our critical response to it. You know, so I think the view that we're all constrained by one truth regime or another is mistaken, but the idea that truth regimes don't exist is also mistaken.
Professor Dasker, thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Me, sorry?
Yes. Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm not used to people calling me Professor Dasker.
Please.
But thank you. So just that it's been such a great and I would say profound lecture speech. I don't have a question. I just sort of want to trace our steps back a little bit and highlight one thing you said, Jeffrey, which I think is really important to emphasize. You're sort of going against the idea that there is a monolithic West and a monolithic East, right? I think this is really important. We are living in an increasingly globalized, interdependent, interconnected world, and you will see groupings and discourses in the West that finds its closest allies with in the East, and similarly you will see ideas emerging in the East that finds very sort of comfortable bedfellows in the West. I think this is something that's very important to remember. Otherwise we let ourselves get caught up in anachronistic lines of reasoning, anachronistic conclusions. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to magnify, emphasize. It's a really important point. I think especially for us Afghans, for people from Afghanistan. Yeah.
So I want to respond to your observation, and you're giving me an opportunity to say something. Important about my presence at the university. When I started my association with the university, it was, I spoke to a number of you before the fall of the Republic, including you, Muska, and Haroon. and I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to, I was curious, and I immediately realized I didn't only learn about what was going on, but I realized that I have colleagues in Afghanistan. So when I was invited first to give a course and now to join the university full time, I had some hesitation. Well, look, I'm an outsider. I really don't know that much about Afghanistan, though I'm trying to learn more. I respect differences, as my answer to the previous question. I want to be very, very careful not to impose the wisdom of the wise West on the ignorant natives. That's also the spirit that I went to Eastern Europe. I didn't go there as the smart American. I learned much more from them, I think, than they learned from me, as I'm anticipating the same thing is going to happen with this experience. But I do know that that there are people from now and in Afghan history, in its long history, who are my colleagues, and there are also people in my immediate community, in my historic religious identified community, who are so foreign to me. I'm so much closer to you than I am to them. Uh, uh, and and I think that there are certain kind of authoritarians in the United States who are closer to the Taliban uh, than than they are to me. So we have it's sometimes these complications are frustrating because it makes it hard to kind of identify and act, but sometimes they present remarkable opportunities. So yeah, that's my response.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.
And I therefore don't feel guilty that I'm teaching at the university.
We absolutely appreciate it. I personally enjoy talking to you. Yes. Thank you very much. And for the interest of time, I do have to conclude, even though I think the conversation is, at least for myself, is very educational. There is one question from Bariole in the chat that I will just answer very quickly. I think the way we solve the problem of the tension between Islam, quote unquote, and what you may perceive as liberal conception of rights is honestly to take both of them seriously, because I think Afghans take both of them seriously, and you have to arrive at the synthesis. And neither of them, I think, should be completely ignored as a source of value, as a source of inspiration. I think if you take both of them seriously, and that would allow you to engage with people who take those two different kind of sets of ideas seriously, and you can engage with them. Hopefully, it will enrich your own understanding of what it means to be actually a right-bearing human being, and also it may help you understand and appreciate others who conceive of themselves as human beings in this world differently. And I think as long as those interactions are happening, I think that's a crux of what Professor Goldfarb is arguing, that you will be able to create a society that recognizes rights, because the process itself is going to produce something that is acceptable to a broader public, rather than a formal truth regime that relies on powers other than a public space and open critical inquiry as a way to justify itself. If you have a way of justifying yourself that does not require you relying on those truth power regimes, and I think the only way to do that is to take everyone's ideas seriously and engage with them, you can actually reach, I think, the sort of kind of general understanding that many people are hinting at. We need some sort of general understanding to actually have a functioning society. It cannot be breakdown of everyone basically sticking to their own positions and then having to fight it out, like Afghanistan has been over the past 40 years, through means other than dialogue and persuasion. But that's just my last 2 cents. And Professor Goldfarb, I will give you the last word, and then we'll conclude afterward.
Okay, so I just building on that, this is a specific dilemma in Afghanistan, but it's a kind of general problem. How do am I a liberal Democrat? Well, yes and no. There are things about liberalism and democracy, and those two things coming together that I'm deeply committed to. But sometimes people connect them to things that I'm not deeply committed to. So I think liberalism, as a philosophical position, at least in some variants, doesn't pay enough attention to community, and glorifies the isolated individual in ways that are problematic. On the other hand, if liberalism means freedom of speech or over association, then of course I'm a liberal. So we have to work on the big package and consider the parts that we're committed to. And then, of course, there is this limitation. There are regimes that have different fundamental positions that are absolute in their certainty that they have the truth. And bringing those regimes together and any other alternative is impossible. And such regimes have to be subverted. Such regimes have to be challenged. So if liberalism is enacted in that way, and it can be, it has to be challenged. If religion is enacted in that way, and it also often has been, but it's been other things as well, then it has to be challenged. So, yeah, I think you know I'm coming away from this discussion that the recognition of difference is actually crucial to our conversation, Haroon. Yeah, so that's my last word. And again, thank you very much. I feel at home, I'm very excited to continue this conversation in the future.
I know I said last word, but Professor Desker, I think you raised your hand. I'll give you the last word now.
It was a mistake. I'm so sorry. I actually wanted to click on the heart because I really liked what was being said. So it was a mistake. Sorry about that, guys.
Thank you. And Nahid, I think one thing you should take away from this conversation is that what you're saying here is essentializing the meaning of both of the things you're actually talking about. But what we're discussing is that maybe all of those things are open to critical inquiry, and they don't have to be defined in diametrically opposed way if you unpack each of them. Into dialogues with others, because no human being can sit at home and reflect on these things and come to the truth or whatever it may be. Just talking to other people who have views that are opposed to you and taking their views seriously, and then reflecting on your own views in action with them, and doing all this in the context of actions, not just passivity of I just have to figure everything out before I do act. I think you should try to act inconsistent with your beliefs as they evolve as well. Hopefully, if everyone does that, we'll arrive at a better place. Even though, as Professor Goldfarb said, we may not know where that is because it's not a foregone conclusion what that may be. But I think it is the best process to get somewhere that would be a place where I think I would personally would like to live. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and especially thank you, Professor Goldfarb, for sharing your time and your insight. We really appreciate it. We'll have another Rule of Law lecture next semester. I hope you join us then as well. Thank you so much, Professor Desker, for your comments and contribution. Thank you, everyone, all the colleagues, Professor Nuristani and others who took the time to be here, Dr. Allah and everyone. Take care, stay safe, and see you in classes or other places. Bye.